Pouring out of Syria with little more than the clothes on their backs, the number of refugees seeking safety beyond their borders tops 2 million. The United Nations describes the crisis as a disgraceful humanitarian calamity. But what is the international community doing to help? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Shihab Britansi. Driven by desperation and now with the added fear of imminent airstrikes, an ever-growing number of Syrians are seeking sanctuary in neighbouring countries. The UN Refugee Agency says the number of Syrian refugees has now passed 2 million. This time last year it was 230,000. Lebanon has taken in the highest number of refugees to date. It's Syria's smallest neighbour, yet has registered nearly 750,000 people. Jordan has opened its doors to more than 500,000 refugees. Turkey is fast approaching that figure. More than 170,000 refugees have crossed into Iraq and 111,000 have fled to Egypt. Added to this, the UN says more than 4 million people have been forcibly displaced within Syria. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Antonio Guterres, says Syria has become a, quote, disgraceful humanitarian calamity with suffering and displacement unparalleled in recent history. But he added that the only solace is the humanity shown by the neighbouring countries in welcoming and saving the lives of so many refugees. More than half of Syria's refugees are children, and the UN estimates 3/4 of them are under the age of 11. An average of 5,000 Syrians are crossing into neighbouring countries every day. The UN says it's placing an overwhelming burden on those countries' infrastructures, economies and societies. And with the number of refugees predicted to reach 3 million by the end of the year, it's appealing for massive international support to help them deal with the crisis. We'll be hearing from Al Jazeera correspondents throughout the course of this programme, but first let's bring in our panel. In Geneva, Melissa Fleming, spokeswoman for the UN Refugee Agency, the UNHCR. In London, Paul Forsyth, Programme Officer on the Global Response Team at World Vision. And also in our London studios, we have Sharif Nashashibi, an award-winning journalist covering the story whose own family in Syria has been displaced during the crisis. He's also chairman and co-founder of Arab Media Watch. Melissa Fleming, first of all, clearly the number of refugees now who are displaced beyond Syria's borders is huge, but what's also striking is the rate of displacement, that the number of those who've fled Syria has doubled in 6 months.
Yes, imagine this. Every 15 seconds, a new Syrian becomes a refugee. Every day, we see about 6,000 people crossing international borders into neighboring countries. These numbers are disgraceful. They're numbers that reflect a horrific, dangerous, violent situation, driving people from their homes, people who, as a last resort, leave their homes and take refuge in neighboring countries.
But when we talk of 2 million, what exactly does that mean? Is that the number then who've registered or are in the process of registering with the UNHCR? What about those who haven't registered?
Well, there are, by government estimates, hundreds of thousands of Syrians more in their countries. They haven't come forward, although increasingly we're seeing Syrians who used to be middle class, who used to have means. Their savings have dried up in exile, and they're coming forward and asking, actually, UNHCR at this point in time for assistance. So you have the more well-off, not necessarily registered with UNHCR, but that doesn't mean that soon they will become persons in equal need of assistance.
But very quickly, are there any estimates?
As they're not able to work anymore and they've lost everything they've owned.
Are there any estimates for the number of those who haven't registered there?
It's all I can say is it's in the hundreds of thousands. We can't possibly know how many Syrians are in the countries if they don't come forward to us and ask for assistance.
All right. Well, clearly then, as we mentioned, Lebanon has taken in the largest proportion of refugees, at least those who've been registered so far. Zaina Hada has more.
The difference between Lebanon and other neighboring countries is the fact that there's no official refugee camps for these people. Many of them live among the local population, and that really has started to cause tensions with the local community. Lebanese say Syrians are taking our jobs, they're accepting lesser wages, so they are taking our own opportunities. At the same time, the Lebanese government really complaining about its inability to help the Syrians because they don't have enough financial resources. As you can see, many of the Syrians live in impoverished neighborhoods. Those who can afford to survive on their own are renting apartments, and the prices, for example, of the rent of apartments is skyrocketing. So tensions between the local community and the Syrians, and more importantly is that Syrians are started to be looked at as a security threat. Lebanon hasn't been able to stay out of the conflict in Syria. We've seen security incidents, bombings, kidnappings, all related to the Syrian conflict. And so many Lebanese now look at a Syrian and say, you brought this instability to our country.
Sharif Nashashibi, I wonder, clearly Lebanon and Syria have a very close relationship. Many Lebanese sought refuge in Syria during the Lebanese civil war. But I wonder how that relationship is affecting Lebanon's response to the refugee crisis now, and indeed Lebanon's previous history of taking in refugees, notably the de facto permanent presence of the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon. How does all this fit into the mix, do you think?
Well, I think the situation in terms of the Syrian refugees in Lebanon is the most precarious because Lebanon has the most number of Syrian refugees. It is probably the least equipped to handle that many refugees, and you have a sectarian element to Lebanese society, regardless of the refugee crisis, which is being greatly exacerbated by the crisis. So you have all these different factors coming together that's causing a great deal of tension and resentment towards Syrians in Lebanon. And my mother's family are from Aleppo, and many of them have fled to Beirut, and they'll tell you that it's, they don't feel very welcome, that there's a lot of tension there, and the situation at the best of times in Lebanon is tense and is getting much worse. If you think about it now, 1 in every 6 people in Lebanon is a Syrian refugee. That's a huge proportion, and they don't have anywhere near the means for themselves or international aid to help cope with that number of people, as well as Palestinian refugees and so on.
Sharif, we'll get on to the economics then, but you raise an interesting point. How do you think the influx of Syrian refugees into Lebanon is playing into the political and sectarian fault lines that already exist in Lebanon?
Well, the fault lines in Lebanon are very much reflected in terms of policy towards Syria and towards the conflict specifically. So different parties and politicians and communities in Lebanon have reacted in different ways. Some have been more welcoming than others, but there's a general sense that Lebanon economically cannot handle that many refugees, and that's a very widespread sense in Lebanon, and it is a legitimate sense. It's the smallest country with the largest number of refugees, and it's not a tenable situation in the long term.
Paul Forsyth, that's an interesting point then. We often think of refugee camps as of the sort that we often see in northern Iraq or elsewhere, but in Lebanon, though, these are very much refugees who join the host population. What sort of impact does that have on the economy, on jobs, on inflation, on all these other factors?
Yeah, the situation is, it's not just in Lebanon, also in Jordan, the majority of the refugees actually are living outside of the refugee camps. So across the region, this situation is causing a huge impact on the communities that are actually hosting these refugees. You go and talk to the people in these communities, and you hear that rent is going up, food prices are going up. It's harder and harder for people to get jobs over there. So this situation is having a very severe impact, not only on the refugees, but also on those communities that are actually hosting them as well.
Melissa Fleming, what rights do these refugees have, though, once they are in other countries? And we know that there are various international conventions. I don't think Lebanon is actually a signatory of the International Convention on Refugees. I may be wrong about that. But Melissa, what rights do they have once they are in these countries?
True. The countries, it has to be said, have been remarkably generous. They've kept their borders open, and I think for any refugee fleeing from danger, the most important, the most hospitable thing that you can do is to keep your borders open and let them in. All of these neighboring countries have kept their borders open. They're hosting these refugees. Proportionally, vast parts of the population are now refugees. So yes, it depends on the country, what kind of rights they have. Do they have freedom of movement? Can they leave the camp? Can they go into the communities and work? It does depend on the country. The refugee status that UNHCR gives these refugees does give them an identity, does give them a right to be there, and in many cases gives them the right to circulate, to find work, and to see what they can do. It is true what the previous speaker just said, that it is putting a strain on the society. There's a competition for jobs, for example. On the other hand, I've heard stories where Syrians are very enterprising, and you have a lot of talent that has left Syria, and they are actually Syrians who are positively contributing to society, starting businesses, et cetera, and helping each other.
But
so it's not all negative.
But given Lebanon's history of taking in refugees, particularly again those Palestinian refugee camps which have been there for so long, does that explain some reluctance perhaps to give the Syrian refugees any kind of official status which would give them more rights? They're just basically sort of guests, informal guests, if you like.
I think the issue is whether refugees should be placed in a camp in Lebanon, or whether they should continue hosting them in the communities. Actually, UNHCR's position is that we would prefer refugees not to have to live in refugee camps. Refugee camps are miserable places. It's easier, of course, for us to deliver and assist when everybody has the same tent. We know exactly where everyone is. But in communities, you have the opportunity to blend in with the population, to interact with the community. In many places in Lebanon and Jordan, in Turkey, people are being hosted by families who are just saying, I want to do something to contribute. I have an empty room. In Lebanon, we have a scheme whereby we're actually offering families to refurbish and to renovate and to install toilets, for example, and sanitary facilities in their homes in exchange for hosting refugee families. So a little bit of incentive there to give back to the communities. One of the things that we are calling on the international community for is to really heavily invest in Jordan and in Lebanon in particular, in their communities, in their infrastructures, so that they can continue and go on having the ability and having more of an ability to hosting these refugees as the conflict doesn't show any signs of ending anytime soon, and as people continue to flee.
All right, well, let's take a look at life in those camps, which, as has been suggested, is where, in many ways, refugees do surrender a great deal of their freedom in return for not being caught up in the Syrian war. Anita McNaught now reports from outside one such camp in Turkey.
More than 35,000 Syrian refugees at this camp alone, over 200,000 registered in Turkey, and up to 300,000 more floating somewhere around the country trying to find a way to live. They're not happy to be here. They'd go back tomorrow if they could, but they can't. Rebel victories in the north of the country haven't meant that northern Syria is any safer for the civilians to live in. As you know, the airstrikes have proven that, so they stay here. And for Turkey, one long series of foreign policy disappointments after another. They didn't think the refugee numbers would top 100,000. They were thinking that the international community would enforce a buffer zone in Syria, a no-fly zone, humanitarian corridors, anything to lift the refugee pressure off Turkey. But that never happened. And in the end, the buffer zone ended up being inside Turkey, and Turkey accommodating far more refugees than it ever believed this country politically or economically could withstand. And on it continues.
Anita McNaught reporting. Paul Forsyth, is it possible to give us an overview, though, of conditions in these camps? I mean, clearly we have the usual concerns of food and shelter and disease, or is it, as one might expect, that in different areas there are different concerns, different priorities, different problems?
The camps, as you said, there are different concerns and different problems across the different camps. But any time you put a large number of people in a small space for an extended period of time, I mean, you do get a lot of problems there. And so just the numbers of people in some of these camps, like in looking at Zaatari camp in Jordan, I mean, the size of the camp is absolutely enormous. So just the logistical job to actually feed and house these people is absolutely enormous. So it's a huge challenge to actually work in these camps and make sure that these camps are fit for humans to live in.
And Melissa Fleming, 52% of that of the registered refugee population are children under 17, so that presumably has particular issues. I mean, education clearly one of them. Then there's in Jordan, the UN Women Organization said 80% of Jordan's refugee population are women and children. So then there's also the issue of gender-based insecurity as well. I mean, how are all these issues factoring in right now?
Oh, absolutely. I think one of the big tragedies of this conflict is how many children are affected, traumatized, wounded, out of school I mean, we meet children all the time who missed 2 years of school since the start of the conflict in Syria and have come into refugee status and refugee camps and still are not in school, even though we're trying. In the Zatri refugee camp in Jordan, which is by now the 4th largest city of Jordan and the 2nd largest refugee camp in the world, there are 60,000 children in that camp. And I can tell you our partner UNICEF, in charge of education, is doing all it can to establish schools and to keep these kids constructively busy. And we're also really trying to work with them because the trauma and the signs of trauma that they show on a day-to-day basis are really troubling. These are the future of Syria, and we need to be able to work with them right now and to see if we can ease their suffering and give them hope for their future and education.
Paul, I mean, despite the displacement, the suffering, the conditions, is there any sense of normality in these camps? Do informal economies spring up? Is there any sense of community that springs up?
Yes, I mean, there are sort of informal economies will spring up within these camps, and there is a sense of community that is fostered there. I mean, it does help when there are programs that are run by UNHCR and UNICEF that are doing a lot of work inside the camps to make sure, that life is as normal as possible for these refugees there. But these people are living in very desperate situations, so it is very challenging to actually build that sense of normality for these refugees.
Sharif, I wonder though, I mean, you were talking about how the influx of refugees has affected the pre-existing conditions, political fault lines in Lebanon. I wonder in these camps, do you hear of, well, I mean, how does it work? What about the very real and passionate debates about Assad, about having him step down and so forth? Do those continue on then in these camps? How do people deal with these issues in the camps? Do we know?
Well, yeah, I mean, the refugee population is not homogenous politically. I mean, there are obviously divisions within refugees, and that will obviously play out within those camps. You also have as I said, the added the tension within the populations of the host nations towards these refugees. So, you are getting increasing amounts of tension, and I think the refugees tend to be viewed by regionally and even internationally as some homogenous group, but they are, they transcend political lines. There are refugees of all sorts, in the Syrian population that are languishing in these camps. So, yeah, there will be differences, but that pales into in comparison with the need to just to give them a decent standard of living and to get them back into their homeland, to a stable, prosperous and decent living. And the sad thing is that the camps are taking on a kind of state of near permanence. You have schools being built, and obviously these are good things in terms of educating the children. But you are seeing institutions being built in these camps that are signs that they're not going home anytime soon, and that's a tragedy. And we are losing an entire generation of Syrians. Particularly given that so many of them are children. We're losing an entire generation that they will be scarred for life by the experiences that they're going through now.
Right, well, let's take a look at the international response there, not just then in funding and helping these humanitarian efforts of the refugees, but perhaps in trying to curtail or prolong the war in Syria. Imran Khan reports now from northern Iraq.
This is Khargos camp. Let me show you how much has grown in the last couple of weeks. When I arrived here 2 weeks ago, it was about a third full. Take a look at it now. It stretches all the way up across that hill. I spoke to many Syrians here, and they're saying, look, it feels like we could be here for a very long time. We don't want to be. We want the West to act. We want our situation to change, and we want to go home. But for now, The real issue here is a funding crisis. The UNHCR has about a third of the money it's been promised by international donors. It doesn't have that money to cope with the influx of refugees. Any potential military action could make that refugee here in this country a lot worse than it already is. Save the Children, another NGO that's working here, saying we don't have the money right now, we're up to capacity. If there is any more refugees coming in, we're going to have to ask the international community for money. But the international community hasn't given the money that they've promised so far, so the likelihood of them giving more money is just not there at the moment.
Imran Khan reporting. Melissa Fleming, where are we then on that record-breaking international appeal of the UNHCR? There was a report in the New York Times this morning that suggested clearly you're nowhere near your target, but most of the money that has come in is from the US and Kuwait. Then a third of it is a combination of Europe, Japan, Canada, Australia, I think, and barely anything from Russia or China. I mean, is there a breakdown? Are those figures sorts of accurate? Is everyone contributing as they should be?
I have to say the donations have been tremendous. It is a lot of money that is being given for the humanitarian cause. The problem is it's just not enough. I mean, it is the worst displacement crisis in 20 years. There is not a single country on earth that has more people on the run right now, and the humanitarian needs for millions and millions of people are from A to Z, and it's very, very expensive. So in order just to provide for the basic needs, just to allow these people to survive, to be fed, to be treated medically, to have a flimsy shelter over their head, we have to constantly go out and appeal for more money and more money. We are right now, UNHCR, about 50% funded. Other organizations are even less funded. So we are in a constant fundraising mode, and we really hope that non-traditional donors, also the private sector, will step up and with full of sympathy for the victims of this conflict and help more.
Paul, how's World Vision doing? What did donors tell you? Are you anywhere near your goals?
We're in a similar situation to UNHCR. I mean, we are at about 50% funded, and like UNHCR, we're in a constant state of fundraising, going out there, trying to put out our message, trying to put out the stories, and tell the world of the huge needs in this region. You know, as Melissa said, the needs are from A to Z. It's absolutely everything. The majority of these people have fled Syria with nothing, and so when they arrive in these countries, you have to provide almost everything for them, and it's extremely expensive.
Sharif, there is that sense that this leads inevitably to a discussion of priorities. I mean, there's plenty of discussion about military action, very costly military action, no doubt, in what is already an international proxy war in many ways, lots of international support, millions of dollars going into weaponry and so forth. And yet the consequences of this international conflict don't seem to be being addressed by the international community. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
I think so. I mean, it is such a shockingly shameful stain on the international community that we are not just talking here about insufficient funding being pledged. We're talking about insufficient pledges being honored. And providing aid for refugees should be and is the most uncontroversial aspect of foreign involvement in the Syrian conflict. I mean, what can be, what can be more just, what can be more necessary than providing aid to these refugees? It's a non-political issue, and yet the international community is not focused on it to the extent that it is. You know, we see all sides are being armed. There is all talk of diplomacy, and yet, as you said, the consequences, the very real human consequences, are not being addressed sufficiently. And it's such a shockingly shameful situation. And again, completely uncontroversial. These are refugees. They must be helped. And there's nothing political about that. And we don't see them getting anywhere near the amount of help that they should. Right. And as the other speakers have said, the numbers are going to continue rising, and so will the need.
But any ideas how to change this? How to convince a change in priorities?
You know, this is what's sad, is that, you know, I don't think anything more can be done to convince the world that this is a really urgent situation, the most urgent situation among the refugee issue as a whole in the world, and particularly with the Syrian crisis. What more can be done to show people that this is the utmost priority? I despair. I don't know what else can be done.
And we'll leave the discussion there. My thanks to all of my guests, Melissa Fleming, Paul Forsyth and Sharif Nashashibi. And don't forget, you can always follow this story and many more at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And why not leave us your comments and suggestions there too. Thanks for watching. I'm Shihab Ratansi. Goodbye for now.